The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 11th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus says, "But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." At that time, Jesus said, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. This past spring, the adult class spent some time watching a couple of different videos. The first video was a video of Pastor Nadia Boltz-Weber. Nadia Boltz-Weber is the pastor at House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver, Colorado, a Lutheran pastor. She kind of challenges some people a little bit. The other video that we watched was from the 2013 Synod Assembly of Diana Butler Bass making her presentations and talking about kind of what she sees framing out in the landscape of our culture, particularly with respect to faith and spirituality and religious practice. In addition, over the past year or two, maybe even three, but over the past period of time, our congregation council at Zion has been spending time listening to and paying attention to how things are happening around us. And in the midst of all of these conversations, I started to realize that what was forming was, well, I think some people would call it a perfect storm. That a whole lot of things are starting to come together, and it is manifesting in some challenging ways. Some of the statistics that I started to wrestle with are these, and let me just put these out there. Over the past 30 years, Boone County has averaged a decline in population by 100 people each year, on average. That means over the past 30 years, 3,000 people have left the county, if you will. On average, now there are outlier families, but on average, family size has gotten smaller. That means that even when in worship, we have the same number of families in worship, we don't have as many people. David Lowe's several years ago talked about how just as 50 years ago we could get one, maybe two, maybe three whole networks and channels on our television. And today, 60, 70, 100, hundreds of channels. We can all pick our little niche and stay there and have no common experience with many of the other people around us. What has happened, he talks about, is that what used to be duty, like attending worship on a regular basis, is now something that people treat as discretionary. We get to make a decision about whether we're going to do this or not. And one of the ways that that plays out is that where 30 and 40 years ago, people who were considered to be regular attenders of worship were in worship 3 to 4 times a month. Now, regular participation, not just at church, but in other things, means showing up 6 or 7 times a year, or once every 6 or 7 weeks. Things have started to change in the culture around us. And to cap all that off, we've all heard about that emergence of the nuns, right? How as we go generation by generation by generation, what used to be a very small slice of the pie that was associated with those who identify as having no religious affiliation, now when we look at those, and these are nationwide statistics, but when we look at those who are in their 18 to 30 cohort, those who identify as having no religious identification are about 34% of the population. Things have changed around us. Now, taken together, these statistics can indicate all kinds of things, and quite frankly, they can bring a lot of fear. Things that we once could count on don't happen, don't exist. The ways that we could encourage or get people to do the things that we wanted to do don't work anymore. The things that once happened, even if they still are there, are changing dramatically, maybe even dying off. Now, some of these things haven't quite come all the way home to Boone County, to Albion, Nebraska, to us. And yet it's quite possible that we can see them on the horizon. One of the gifts of being in a place like Albion, where things like this don't come home to roost too quickly, is that we can see the future. And we have questions that we can answer, and there are ways that we can respond. But in the end, all of this signals that indeed we need to be paying attention. And we need to know that there will be anxiety, there will be fear, there will be times that we will want to just stay away, not engage it, not deal with it. We may even want to act like nothing has changed. And those are choices that we can make. Now, about this point, you're thinking, Pastor, where are you going and what are you talking about? And what I want to do is invite you to think about what we heard proclaimed from Zechariah today, where Zechariah announces the coming of a king. And as you hear that, you hear something that harkens to what we hear on Palm Sunday, where a king comes on a donkey into Jerusalem, Jesus. But important to listen to is that this announcement that Zechariah is making is to a people for whom everything that they had come to depend on was wiped out, was gone. Everything that they thought they could depend on had died and gone away. And Zechariah announces today, look, There is a new thing coming, and this is a king who is not about all that militant, military, beat them down kind of rule, but rather is a king of peace. Now, over this past week, as I have wrestled with these texts, as I've listened to them, I found one phrase, one turn of phrase. It was a small thing that has just clung to me. Did you hear it? Prisoners of hope. Zechariah said it. He tells the people to return to their strongholds, and then he calls them prisoners of hope. And I started to think about ways that our hope can imprison us. Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to hang on to what was, or go back to the way things were, or place our hope in the way that we've always known it. That those very things imprison us, hold us hostage, keep us from embracing the future, the new future that God is working in our midst. It's in the midst of listening to those words of Zechariah speaking to that people who have been hanging on to the hope that their lot would be restored in some way by going back to the way things were. And Zechariah invites them to let go of that hope and embrace a whole new kind of hope. I wonder if that isn't some of what Jesus is doing today. As Jesus is speaking to the crowd and he asks, "To what shall I compare this generation?" And he says that is like, well, let's see. Let's read it. It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, "We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn." It didn't matter whether we threw a big party or we grieved deeply. It didn't help. Sometimes those are the responses that we have. Let's just throw a party and be happy and just hope that it will pass. Other times we grieve and we wail and we lament, and sometimes that doesn't help. But what Jesus lifts up is that there is a new way. Did you hear what he said at the end? "Come to me, all you who are weary, all who are struggling, and I will give you rest." Over the past couple of weeks, something has shifted, and I've been paying attention to the ways in which I have had many conversations with people who are struggling and hurting and frustrated and feeling disrespected and unappreciated, and I believe that what I am hearing in those conversations, while for us we experience them as personal, and they are affecting us in deeply personal ways, and yet I suspect that in the midst of our personal crisis, what we don't see is that there's something larger going on, and it affects not just us, but it affects all of our culture. It affects all of our organizations. It affects all of our service clubs. It affects our congregation. It affects our families. And as these changes are afoot, it's easy to feel hurt and weighed down and burdened. What Jesus says is, "Come to me. My yoke is not like the yoke that you have received before." What Jesus is talking about is he's talking to a people who experienced the scriptures, the law and the prophets, as a tool, kind of like a yoke that gives them guidance, a yoke that helps them to function more efficiently, a yoke that helps with the relationships, if you will. But those laws, those ways of living into that, the way they had been interpreted, all of that was no longer working for them. It had become messy. And so Jesus invites them to a new way, and that new way is a way in which they experience God as already present. In some ways, what Jesus has been announcing all through his ministry is that indeed heaven is for real, and more so, heaven has already come to live among you. I have come. God has come. And we are here with you in the midst of all of this. And the rule and the law that I am offering, that is your new yoke, is a yoke where we understand God's love to dwell within us, where we experience God's forgiveness as presence, where God is enabling and reconciling our relationships and giving us strength and clarity to move forward, where God in Jesus Christ is making new creation so that we may have new life. And so in this time, when all the things that are going on that are getting us twisty and anxious and feeling hurt, the promise we have today is that no matter where we are, God is with us. God has chosen to walk with us. And that we can get through this perfect storm, moving into the new reality that God is enacting in our presence and in our time. We can get through this when and as we trust in the promises that God bears. Promises of new life. Promises of love and forgiveness. Promises of reconciliation. Promises that this is not the whole story. That out of death comes new life. We are a people of the resurrection. At the same time, we know that we cannot have resurrection without death. And so we walk in this time trusting that no matter what, God is with us.